The sea on a winter's night possesses a unique ability to soften the world's sounds. Above the water, the half-moon hung faintly in the sky, casting a delicate trail of silver across the swells of the Pacific. Each wave rose and fell in a rhythm that felt timeless, seemingly oblivious to the vast conflict occurring across continents. The only sound was the wind brushing over the water, and even that was merely a whisper. For any sailor on watch aboard a Japanese destroyer that night, the scene might have appeared tranquil, almost misleadingly so. However, beneath the glimmering surface of the ocean, a predator lay in wait. The submarine was USS Archerfish, a Balao-class vessel of the United States Navy. She measured 301 feet in length, constructed of welded steel and coated in a dull gray paint. Her conning tower appeared as a mere shadow against the moonlit sea when she surfaced, with her periscope and radar antenna barely visible above the horizon when she submerged. Inside her pressure hull, the air was thick and oppressive, infused with the scents of oil, sweat, and machinery. Crew members moved silently around valves, gauges, and plotting tables, their voices subdued, their focus unwavering. They had been engaged in warfare for years, yet in this moment, something felt distinct. A monumental event was in progress. At the heart of it was Commander Joseph F. Enright, a 33-year-old officer with dark eyes and a reputation that had recently been in question. He had experienced failure in the past. During a previous command, he had faltered at critical junctures and returned from patrol without discharging a single torpedo. For a submariner in wartime, such a mission was not merely disappointing, it was disgraceful. Enright had even sought to be relieved of his command. Believing that his instincts had let him down, he carried that burden into every decision he made now. This evening, in the dark waters south of Honshu, he aimed to redeem himself. Enright positioned himself at the periscope, one hand lightly gripping the handle, while the other fingered a rosary in his pocket. He was a Catholic, and although he did not display overt piety, he found solace in that string of beads when the weight of responsibility bore down on him, and it was indeed a heavy burden. This evening, somewhere to the north, beyond the headlands of Tokyo Bay, a massive Japanese vessel was in motion. The radar operator had first detected it, merely a blip, 12 miles away, maintaining a steady southwest course. The contact was substantial, unmistakably so, and Enright felt deep within him that this was no ordinary fighter. The pressing question was, what was it? Earlier in the evening, the Archerfish had been assigned to lifeguard duty, poised to rescue downed American airmen from raids that never took place. Now, free to navigate, she had encountered a significant target, though none aboard were yet aware of its true significance. Enright's mind drifted to the formidable Japanese battleships, the Yamato and Musashi Titans, that had once dominated the seas. Just weeks prior, Musashi had been sunk at Lady Gulf, ravaged by waves of American bombers. Could it be that Yamato herself was emerging? Or was this something even more peculiar, something unprecedented? The submarine quivered slightly as it altered its course. In the control room, crew members leaned over the plotting board, mapping out the lines of relative motion, adjusting bearings with grease pencils. They operated with a quiet urgency, acutely aware that timing and geometry could mean the difference between life and death. An error in this moment could not only result in losing the target, but could also provoke destruction from the destroyers that were undoubtedly screening her. For the time being, however, the Archerfish maintained her distance, shadowing on the surface, utilizing the darkness and the thin veil of cloud to conceal her silhouette. Inside the submarine, the atmosphere was tense, yet disciplined. The crew had long adapted to living in confined spaces. Torpedo men rested alongside their weapons in the forward room. Officers shared bunks in shifts, and every man instinctively knew his position. The air was filled with a constant hum. Fans, pumps, and the low murmur of the diesels when surfaced. Men donned sweat-stained karis, some reduced to undershirts in the humid compartments. On nights like this, every sound heightened nerves. The creaking of the hull as the sea pressed in, the slapping of waves against the bow, and the faint hum of the radar screen. Each noise was amplified by anticipation, and Enright was determined not to let that anticipation turn into hesitation again. He had made that decision months earlier while seated at a poker table at Midway Naval Base. A senior officer had observed his bold bluffing and inquired, "Joe, would you command a submarine the way you play cards?" His response had been straightforward. Yes, that response had earned him another opportunity. Now, at the periscope, that opportunity was on the verge of being tested. What Enright could not yet comprehend was the magnitude of what awaited him. The vessel he was tracking was Shinano, the pride of Japanese shipyards, weighing in at 71,890 tons when fully loaded. She was the largest aircraft carrier ever constructed. Completed in secrecy, she had been commissioned only days prior and sent into the night with minimal training and incomplete systems. She was intended to be a symbol of strength and defiance. Instead, she was unknowingly heading toward a solitary submarine commanded by a man who craved redemption as desperately as the Japanese Navy sought a miracle. The moon briefly hid behind a shroud of clouds, casting a shadow over the horizon. In that moment, the crew aboard Archerfish sensed the ocean grow even quieter, as if it were holding its breath. Enright leaned into the eyepiece once more. The silhouette was faint, yet it loomed large. He observed the escort's dark shapes cutting through the water surrounding the main vessel. A destroyer turned sharply, racing toward them, and for a fleeting moment, it appeared that the hunter had become the hunted. Then, inexplicably, the destroyer veered off, circled back, and resumed its position alongside its charge. The opportunity remained. Enright whispered to his officers, calm but firm, "Stay with her. Let her zigzag. We'll determine where she straightens out." His words conveyed not only commands, but also a promise to himself, to his crew, and to his career. He would not falter. This time, he would rely on his instincts. He would take action. The clock was ticking toward midnight. Somewhere ahead, the largest warship ever constructed navigated through the night, oblivious to the fact that beneath the tranquil sea, a submarine and her resolute captain had targeted her. The scene was prepared. The intricate game of patience, geometry, and destiny had commenced. The year was 1944, and the momentum of the Second World War had shifted with an undeniable force. For Japan, the empire that had once extended from the icy illusions to the humid jungles of Burma, the conflict was no longer about expansion. It had become a matter of survival. The empire was now on the defensive, battered from aerial assaults, choked at sea, and suffering losses in its outer island fortifications. The Pacific had ceased to be a vast barrier safeguarding the Japanese home islands. It had transformed into a battleground that diminished with each passing month. American forces had surged from island to island in an unyielding advance. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and then the Marianas. Each advance brought U.S. forces closer to the core of Japan. With every landing, the Japanese military was compelled to engage from a position of weakness, stretched thin, with resources depleting and morale plummeting. By the summer of 1944, the campaign in the Philippines had commenced. General Douglas MacArthur, true to his renowned promise, had returned. His troops were fighting their way through Leyte and beyond, while Admiral Chester Nimitz orchestrated the great fleets of the U.S. Pacific Navy in a steady progression toward Okinawa. The oceans themselves had turned hostile to Japanese shipping. Once the Imperial Navy had dominated those waters, but now it was American submarines that ruled beneath the surface. These silent service vessels were proving to be devastatingly effective. Submarines like the Archerfish had shredded Japan's merchant fleet. Tankers transporting oil from the East Indies were sinking faster than they could be replaced. Cargo ships delivering food, weapons, and raw materials were easy targets for submarines equipped with patience and torpedoes. By 1944, Japan had suffered the loss of over half of its merchant fleet, leading to a crippling shortage. Factories began to slow down, fuel became scarce, and even essential supplies were in short supply. The calculations of war had turned mercilessly against Japan, where the empire once had the capacity to replace losses in ships and aircraft. Now every sunk vessel was irreplaceable. The grand shipyards that had built the fleet responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbor were now struggling to repair damaged ships, let alone construct new ones. Steel was in short supply, skilled laborers had been conscripted into the military, and American bombing raids were increasingly targeting industrial hubs. The situation above the waves was equally dire. The U.S. Navy had formed the most formidable carrier strike groups ever assembled. The fast carriers of the 3rd and 5th Fleets roamed freely across the Pacific, their aircraft relentlessly assaulting Japanese bases and even striking the home islands. The skies had become perilous. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, with its extensive range, had initiated daylight bombing missions against Japan's urban centers. Tokyo and Nagoya were engulfed in flames from their firestorms, with more raids on the horizon. The Imperial Navy, once the most advanced and feared force in the Pacific, had become a mere shadow of its former self. Its air force had been decimated. At Midway in 1942, its battleships had suffered heavy losses in the Solomons and the Marianas, and during the monumental Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan had committed all that it had left to one final desperate attempt. The outcome was catastrophic. Carriers such as Zuikaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, were sunk. The formidable battleship Musashi was obliterated under the unyielding onslaught of American bombs and torpedoes. Although Yamato, the largest battleship in existence, had survived the encounter, she had sustained damage and was compelled to retreat. The human toll was equally catastrophic. Japan's seasoned pilots, the very ones who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with such accuracy, were nearly all deceased. Their replacements were trained in haste, frequently with fewer than 50 hours of flight experience before being deployed into combat. In contrast, American pilots reached the front lines with hundreds of hours of training. This disparity resulted in significant losses in the air. Japanese aircraft were being downed at ratios of 10-1, and at times even worse. Japan was running out of time, depleting its fleet and exhausting its options. Nevertheless, even in this dire predicament, the nation held on to one final hope: that a formidable new weapon could alter the balance, if only temporarily. This weapon was not another battleship or a novel aircraft design. It was a vessel unlike any the world had previously encountered, a carrier so enormous, so heavily fortified, and so clandestine that the Allies had no evidence of its existence. Her name was Shinano, named after the ancient Japanese province. Constructed from the hull of a Yamato-class battleship, she was intended to be invulnerable, a bastion at sea. Japanese strategists believed that if this carrier could be finalized and deployed, she might secure their defensive perimeter around the home islands. Perhaps she could transport sufficient aircraft and specialized attack weapons to impede the American advance, or even pose a threat to the invasion fleets that were undoubtedly on the horizon. The strategic rationale behind Shinano mirrored Japan's shifting military doctrine. The Imperial Navy could no longer aspire to decisive battles where superior training and equipment would triumph. Instead, they required a vessel capable of withstanding American aerial assaults, functioning as a mobile base for aircraft maintenance, and delivering the new suicide weapons that were becoming integral to Japanese tactics. The Oka rocket-powered kamikaze planes and Shinyo explosive motorboats epitomized a grim calculation that Japanese lives could be exchanged for American ships at advantageous ratios. Yet, even as Japan constructed her, the harsh realities of war encroached. Shipyard laborers worked in shifts that extended 16 hours or more. Resources were limited, quality diminished, and deadlines loomed ominously. The completion of the Shinano was expedited. So urgent was the situation that essential safety tests were overlooked. The Empire required the ship, and it required her immediately. In Tokyo, the leaders held on to their delusions. If Shinano could operate with a complete air group, she might be able to take down swarms of B-29s. If she could navigate to the Philippines, she might interfere with MacArthur's landings. If she could merely show up off the coasts of Okinawa or Formosa, her presence alone might undermine American confidence. The war was slipping away, yet perhaps, just perhaps, one formidable ship could delay the inevitable. However, desperation cannot replace strength. Japan was already resorting to tactics that revealed the severity of the situation. The kamikaze corps was not a demonstration of strength, but rather a sign of weakness, an acknowledgement that traditional warfare was no longer feasible. Young pilots, some scarcely out of their teenage years, were instructed that their greatest service to the Emperor was to sacrifice themselves by crashing their planes into American vessels. This was a strategy born from despair, cloaked in the rhetoric of honor. The waters surrounding Japan were no longer hospitable. American submarines relentlessly pursued along the coasts. Groups of 3 or 4 submarines would coordinate their assaults on convoys, sinking both escorts and merchant ships indiscriminately. In late November, as Shinano was set to depart from her shipyard, numerous submarines lay in wait in the approaches to Tokyo Bay. They had segmented the waters into patrol areas, with each submarine accountable for its designated sector, all sharing information to synchronize their interception. Most would remain unaware of her existence, but one would not, and that singular encounter would determine her destiny. The larger strategic landscape was evident to any impartial observer. Japan had lost the war. The only remaining questions were how long the conflict would persist and how many lives would be lost before its conclusion. Yet, for those ensnared in the machinery of war, the sailors, the shipbuilders, the pilots, such clarity was unattainable. They persisted in fighting, building, and hoping because the alternative was unimaginable. By November 1944, Japan had become an empire under siege. Its seas were monitored by hidden predators, its skies scorched by incendiary bombs, and its cities quaked under the inevitability of invasion. Into this turmoil sailed Shinano, a massive vessel, unprepared, untested, and bearing the weight of a nation's final aspirations. Awaiting her, concealed in the darkness, was a submarine helmed by a man in search of redemption. Every formidable warship originates as a sketch on paper, lines on a blueprint that promise steel, might, and honor. The narrative of Shinano commenced in precisely that manner. However, Her fate would alter multiple times before she ever encountered saltwater. She was envisioned in 1940 at the pinnacle of Japanese naval ambition as the third of the Yamato-class battleships. These were intended to be the largest, heaviest, and most heavily armed battleships ever constructed, designed to surpass anything afloat in the American or British fleets. Their armor was thicker, their guns larger, and their displacement greater. They stood as emblems of an empire striving for maritime supremacy. The Yamato class embodied a philosophy of naval warfare that had evolved over decades. Japanese strategic thinkers, recognizing that their nation could never rival American industrial strength, believed in qualitative superiority. If Japan could not produce more ships than America, it would create superior ships. Each Yamato-class battleship would equate to 2 or 3 of its American equivalents. Their 18.1-inch guns could hit targets at distances where enemy vessels could not retaliate. Their armor could withstand shells that would cripple lesser ships. 2 of her sister ships were completed to that initial design, Yamato and Musashi, each equipped with 9 colossal guns capable of launching shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds farther and with greater destructive force than any naval artillery that preceded them. These shells could penetrate 16 inches of armor at distances exceeding 25 miles. The keel of Shinano was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of the Empire's premier shipyards, with every anticipation that she would join her sisters in the Pacific as a floating stronghold. The construction commenced with a sense of ceremony and pride. Shinto priests performed blessings on the ground where she was destined to rise. The emperor himself was made aware of the project. The finest steel was designated for her, and the most skilled shipbuilders were assigned to the task. According to the initial plans, she was to displace 72,000 tons when fully loaded, mount the same formidable guns as her sister ships, and cruise at a speed of 27 knots despite her considerable size. She symbolized not merely a weapon, but a testament to Japanese technical excellence. However, wars have a tendency to alter aspirations. In June 1942, Japan experienced a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Midway. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost in a single day. Along with them, hundreds of seasoned pilots and the foundation of Japan's naval air force were also lost. This battle permanently shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan could no longer depend on its carriers to project power as it had during its early victories in 1941 and 1942. The defeat at Midway necessitated a profound re-evaluation of naval strategy. It became evident that aircraft carriers, rather than battleships, had emerged as the decisive instruments of contemporary naval warfare. The era of the big gun was concluding, and the age of the aircraft had begun. The Navy's strategists examined Shinano's enormous hull, still unfinished in her dock, and confronted a dilemma. Completing her as a battleship would mean creating another gun platform in a time when carriers dictated the outcomes of conflicts. Leaving her incomplete was inconceivable. Too much had already been invested. The solution was evident. Shinano would be transformed into an aircraft carrier, not just any carrier, but the largest carrier the world had ever known. The conversion was both radical and intricate. The lower hull, initially designed for a battleship's requirements, needed to be modified for entirely different functions. Her armored citadel, originally intended to endure tremendous shell fire, was reconfigured to accommodate a spacious hangar deck. In place of where gun turrets would have been, aircraft elevators were installed. The superrupture underwent a redesign, repositioned to starboard in the manner of aircraft carriers. An 840 ft long, and 130 ft wide flight deck was constructed above all else. Unlike traditional carriers, she was not intended primarily for launching extensive offensive strikes. Rather, she was conceived as a support carrier, a mobile fortress capable of safeguarding fleets with her armor, repairing aircraft during combat, and transporting suicide planes and motorboats designated for special attack operations. Her hangar could house 47 aircraft with additional storage for another 70 in crates that could be assembled as required. She was designed to function as a floating reserve, replenishing the air groups of other carriers that had incurred losses. This concept mirrored the evolving Japanese strategy. By 1944, Japan could no longer rely on assembling hundreds of trained pilots for conventional warfare. The seasoned aviators who had carried out the Pearl Harbor attack were largely deceased. Their successors were inadequately trained, frequently possessing less than 50 hours of flight experience. Instead of conventional air power, Japan pursued weapons of shock and desperation. Shinano was destined to become their arsenal. The secrecy surrounding her construction was unparalleled. Fearing that American bombers would obliterate the ship before she ever set sail, the Navy implemented extraordinary precautions. The dry dock where Shinano was being constructed was covered by a massive concrete roof, protecting her from the scrutiny of aerial observers. This roof, supported by colossal steel girders, transformed the construction site into an expansive covered workshop. The laborers who worked on her hull were restricted to the yard. They resided in on-site barracks, prohibited from leaving or communicating with the outside world. They faced threats of imprisonment, or worse, if they disclosed any information about what they were constructing. Military police monitored the perimeter. Not a single photograph of Shinano under construction was permitted to exit the yard. Even within the Imperial Navy, knowledge of Shinano was stringently regulated. Only a limited number of officers were authorized to be aware of her specifications. Documents that mentioned her utilized code names. When she finally made her appearance, she would astonish not only the Americans, but also some of her fellow countrymen. This degree of secrecy led to its own set of challenges. Suppliers who delivered materials often lacked knowledge about what they were contributing to. Coordination among the various departments was compromised. Errors that could have been identified through standard oversight went unnoticed. Her design challenged the boundaries of naval engineering. With a full load displacement of 71,190 tons, Shinano surpassed every other carrier in existence. Her armored flight deck, an uncommon feature among carriers, was capable of withstanding 1,000 Don B bombs. The armored belt, measuring up to 8 inches thick at the waterline, provided a level of protection unprecedented in carrier design. Her hangar was segmented by heavy armor intersections designed to prevent a single bomb or torpedo from incapacitating the entire ship. Her propulsion system, consisting of 4 steam turbines generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, was engineered to propel her at speeds of 27 knots despite her considerable size. The defensive armament was impressive, featuring 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns mounted in 8 twin configurations capable of targeting both surface and aerial threats. More than 125mm anti-aircraft guns were strategically placed across her hull, establishing overlapping fields of fire. 12 28-barrel rocket launchers were capable of launching salvos of explosive shells into the sky, forming a steel curtain against incoming aircraft. In theory, she would be nearly impossible for aircraft to approach, let alone to successfully attack. However, despite all this magnificence, Shinano was being constructed during a time of crisis. The workers involved in her construction were no longer the skilled artisans who had built Yamato and Musashi. Many seasoned shipbuilders had been conscripted into military service. Their replacements included conscripts, students, and even prisoners of war. The quality control that had once been the hallmark of Japanese shipbuilding had declined. Welds that should have undergone X-ray inspections for flaws were only subjected to visual checks. Tolerances that were originally intended to be measured in millimeters expanded to centimeters. The pressure to finalize her construction was unyielding. Tokyo insisted that she be completed by November 1944. Work proceeded continuously day and night. Workers collapsed from fatigue and were swiftly replaced by others. The heat within the enclosed dock during summer was oppressive. In winter, the hands of the workers became numb from the cold. The frequency of accidents increased. Workers fell from scaffolding, were crushed by moving steel plates, or succumbed to fumes from welding. Each fatality was kept quiet. The war effort was considered more significant than individual lives. The materials were also compromised. The specialized steel designated for her armor was occasionally redirected to other urgent projects. Inferior alternatives were utilized. Much of the electrical wiring, which had been imported prior to the war, became irreplaceable. When supplies were depleted, makeshift solutions were adopted. Systems that were meant to be redundant turned into single points of failure. The grand ship was being held together as much by resolve as by engineering. In spite of these obstacles, she began to take form. Month after month, her hull ascended higher. Her flight deck moved closer to completion. Her island superstructure emerged from the starboard side. To those who beheld her, even in her incomplete state, she was awe-inspiring. Workers would pause in their tasks to simply gaze at the enormity of what they were constructing. She was not merely a ship. She was a floating city, a testament to human ambition. On the morning of October 8th, 1944, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal stood poised for a moment of triumph. After 4 years of clandestine construction, Japan's most significant shipbuilding gamble was about to touch the water for the first time. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. This was to be more than just a launch. It was to symbolize Japanese resilience, evidence that even amidst bombardment and blockade, the empire could still produce marvels. The day commenced with a grand ceremony. At dawn, Shinto priests, clad in white robes, arrived to perform purification rites. They waved long, flowing wands made of white paper, recited ancient prayers, and scattered salt to cleanse the ground. An altar was constructed near the bow with offerings of rice, fish, and sake placed in front of it. The priests invoked the kami, the spirits of water, wind, and steel, to safeguard the vessel and bestow upon her the gift of victory. High-ranking naval officers arrived in their formal uniforms adorned with numerous medals. Representatives from the imperial household were also in attendance. Workers, weary from years of toil, received new garments for the event. They stood in orderly lines, their pride temporarily overshadowing their exhaustion. Bands performed martial music. Flags waved from every possible location. The concrete roof that had concealed Shinano for an extended period had been partially removed, allowing beams of sunlight to illuminate her hull. The launch plan was meticulously detailed. Dry dock number 6 was to be gradually flooded through controlled valves. As the water level increased, Shinano would rise from her building blocks and float freely. She would then be towed by tugs to a fitting-out pier for the installation of her final equipment. This was a procedure the shipyard had executed hundreds of times before. What could possibly go wrong? At 10:30 a.m., the command was issued to commence flooding. Workers began to turn the valve wheels, and water started to flow into the dock. Initially, everything progressed as expected. The water level rose steadily, inch by inch creeping up Shinano's hull. Onlookers observed with anticipation. Then, without any warning, disaster struck. The Quaison Gate, which sealed dry dock number 6 from Tokyo Bay, collapsed. The enormous steel barrier, intended to hold back the ocean, succumbed to the immense pressure. Instead of a controlled flooding, a deluge of water surged inward with irresistible force. The noise was akin to thunder, a roaring cascade that drowned out all other sounds. Within seconds, millions of gallons of water rushed into the dock. Shinano, rather than rising gently, was struck by a massive wave of water. The colossal ship surged forward like a cork ejected from a bottle. Her 70,000 tons of steel, propelled by hydraulic force, collided with the dock's far wall, resulting in a grinding crash that reverberated through the earth. The impact generated tremors throughout the shipyard, causing windows to shatter a quarter-mile away. Mooring cables as thick as a man's arm snapped like mere threads. The recoil caused them to whip through the air with deadly force. One cable decapitated a worker, while another crushed 3 men against a crane. The massive hull rebounded from the impact and swung sideways, with her stern crashing into the dock's side wall. She oscillated back and forth, resembling a colossal pendulum of destruction, obliterating everything in her path. For several long minutes, chaos reigned supreme. Workers fled in terror, some plunging into the turbulent water to escape the swinging hull, while others were swept away by the deluge. Officers shouted commands that were drowned out by the cacophony. The meticulously planned ceremony had devolved into a catastrophe. The band's instruments lay scattered, flags were torn away, and the Shinto altar was reduced to splinters. When the water finally calmed and Shinano came to a halt, the extent of the damage was assessed. Remarkably, despite the violence, no significant structural damage had occurred to the ship itself. Her hull exhibited dents and scrapes, twisted fittings and broken railings, yet her integrity remained intact. The human toll, however, was a different story. 17 workers lost their lives and 43 were injured. Some bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea, or crushed beyond recognition. Perhaps the most profound damage was psychological. For the Japanese workers and sailors, ships were not merely machines. They were believed to possess spirits, souls that required proper reverence. A ship whose launch was marred by disaster was deemed cursed by the kami. The violent and uncontrolled launch was the worst possible omen. News spread rapidly through Yokosuka and beyond. Whispers accompanied every mention of Shinano's name. She had claimed lives before even touching the sea. The ocean itself seemed to reject her. The kami had turned their faces away. Captain Toshio Abe, who had recently been appointed to lead Shinano, attempted to quell such discussions. A stern and pragmatic officer who had endured the Battle of Midway, he possessed little tolerance for superstition. In an address to the crew, he dismissed the incident as insignificant. Steel and engines lack spirit, he asserted. It is discipline and training that secure victories, not omens. Yet even as he spoke, he could perceive uncertainty in the eyes of his men. Sailors are inherently superstitious, and Japanese sailors are particularly so. Many made private offerings at shrines, seeking protection from the curse they believed lingered over their ship. The repairs following the launch disaster were expedited, as everything concerning Shinano had become hurried. New plates were welded over the damaged sections. Bent fittings were either straightened or replaced. Paint concealed the scars. Within 3 weeks, external signs of the catastrophe had been obliterated, but those who had witnessed it could not forget. The image of that enormous hull crashing back and forth, the cries of crushed workers, the feeling that something fundamentally had gone awry. These memories endured. Work resumed at an even more frantic pace. The November deadline approached. and the accident had consumed valuable time. Safety protocols that were already compromised were further diminished. The watertight doors that should have undergone pressure testing were merely checked to ensure they closed. Electrical systems that required thorough inspections received only superficial reviews. The prevailing assumption appeared to be that if Shinano appeared complete, she was indeed complete. The crew assigned to her mirrored this urgency. Typically, a carrier's crew would train together for months prior to deployment. They would practice until every individual not only understood his own role but could also substitute for others. Damage control, the skill of preserving a damaged ship, necessitated specific expertise. Teams needed to operate in flawless coordination, sealing compartments, operating pumps, combating fires, all while potentially in darkness with the ship listing. However, Shinano's crew was gathered from various sources where men could be located. Veterans from sunken vessels, newly trained recruits, and workers drafted from civilian life were all included. They were assembled with little organization. Many did not even share the same dialect of Japanese. The officers attempted to conduct drills, but the time was insufficient and the crew was inexperienced. During practice for damage control procedures, chaos ensued. Crew members became disoriented in the labyrinth of corridors. Equipment was misplaced. Commands were misinterpreted. Among the crew, discussions of the curse continued. Petty officers reported that crew members were seeking transfers, citing illness, and even injuring themselves to evade sailing on Shinano. The ship's chaplain, a Buddhist priest, performed numerous blessings in an effort to alleviate fears. Yet, each ceremony appeared to highlight the issue rather than resolve it. Why was there a need for so many blessings if nothing was amiss? November arrived with a sense of urgency. The deadline was no longer a distant concern. It had arrived. Whether prepared or not, Shinano was required to set sail. The threat from American submarines intensified daily. Intelligence indicated that numerous enemy vessels were operating within Japanese waters. B-29 bombers were extending their reach further from their bases in the Marianas. It was merely a matter of time before they located and obliterated Shinano at her dock. The final weeks of preparation took on a tone of desperation. Equipment that should have been meticulously installed was carelessly loaded aboard. Crates of supplies were piled wherever space was available. The special weapons designated for her, including 50 Oka suicide rocket planes and several Shinoyo explosive motorboats, were placed into her hangars. These weapons, in themselves, symbols of Japan's desperation, seemed fitting cargo for a ship in such dire straits. On November 11th, 1944, Shinano was formally commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was understated compared to the intended grandeur of her launch. No bands performed. Few dignitaries were present. Captain Abe read the official orders in a monotone voice. The rising sun flag was hoisted on her mast. She was now officially classified as a warship, although she was far from being fully prepared. The commissioning process highlighted her numerous shortcomings, and out of her 12 boilers, only 8 were functional, which diminished her maximum speed from the intended 27 knots to approximately 20 knots. Her radar systems were only partially operational. Half of her anti-aircraft guns were deficient in ammunition. The aircraft elevators designed to transport planes from the hangar to the flight deck had never undergone load testing. Most critically, many of her watertight doors, which serve as barriers to seal off flooded compartments, had not been tested under pressure. Captain Abe compiled a comprehensive list of deficiencies that extended to 17 pages. He submitted this list to Naval Headquarters requesting a postponement of sailing until at least the essential repairs could be addressed. The response was prompt and resolute. Shinano was to sail as planned. The rationale of the naval staff was influenced by political considerations as much as military ones. News of the supercarrier's existence was circulating. She needed to be unveiled as a symbol of strength rather than discovered as a bombed wreck. The sailing orders were explicit. Shinano was scheduled to depart Yokosuka on the night of November 28th, steam south along the coastline, and arrive at Kure Naval Base in the Inland Sea. There, shielded from submarines by narrow straits and from bombers by distance, she would finalize her fitting out. The journey was expected to last only about 20 hours. What could possibly go wrong in 20 hours? The crew readied themselves with a blend of pride and apprehension. They were embarking on the world's largest warship, a technological wonder, yet they were also setting sail on an incomplete vessel with an untrained crew, many of whom harbored superstitions about her being cursed. Final letters were penned to loved ones. Personal belongings were secured. Some crew members visited Shinto shrines, offering prayers and tributes. Others sought solace in sake, attempting to numb their anxieties. The escort for the voyage was minimal, consisting of just 3 destroyers, Isakaze, Yukaze, and Hamakaze. All 3 had extensive experience from numerous battles. Their crews were experienced, yet their ships were worn. The radar and sonar systems damaged in prior engagements had only been partially repaired. Consequently, they would need to depend more on lookouts rather than instruments. This seemed insufficient for the protection of the world's largest carrier. However, every available destroyer was required elsewhere. The night of November 28th, 1944, commenced with a deceptive calm. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, the enormous form of Shinano was preparing for departure. Steam accumulated in her boilers. Navigation lights began to flicker to life. On her bridge, Captain Abe conducted a final review of the charts. The route was uncomplicated. They would proceed south along the coast, around the Aizu Peninsula, then westward to Kure. Traveling at night was necessary to evade American bombers and to remain close to shore to reduce the risk of submarine exposure. At 6 p.m., the mooring lines of Shinano were cast off. Tugs gently nudged her massive bulk away from the pier. Her screws began to turn slowly at first, then with increasing power. The great ship moved under her own power for the first time. Despite all challenges, the rushed construction, the ill-fated launch, the incomplete systems, she was magnificent. Her hull extended nearly 900 of thought, and her flight deck rose 60 feet above the water. She displaced more than most harbors could accommodate. By any standard, she was an engineering marvel. The 3 destroyers assumed their screening positions, with Isokaze leading and Yukikaze and Hamakaze on the flanks. Together, the 4 vessels advanced toward the harbor entrance and the open sea beyond. As they navigated through the submarine nets safeguarding the harbor, several crew members perceived what they interpreted as another ill omen, a dead albatross floating in the water, its white wings spread like a flag of surrender. Unbeknownst to those aboard, 30 miles to the south, USS Archerfish was commencing her patrol. The submarine had been on lifeguard duty, stationed to rescue American airmen from a bombing raid that had been cancelled due to adverse weather. Now free to pursue, Commander Enright had surfaced his boat to recharge the batteries and refresh the air. The night was ideal for submarine operations, dark enough to conceal their low profile, calm enough for optimal sound conditions, with just enough moonlight to identify targets. At 8:48 p.m., the radar operator aboard Archerfish announced contact. Bearing 020, range 12M. The blip on the radar display was large, steady, and moving southwest at approximately 20 knots. Enright hurried to the bridge, raising his binoculars. On the horizon, barely discernible, he could distinguish a dark mass along with the smaller shapes of escorts. His heart raced. This was not a merchant vessel. The size, speed, and presence of escorts all indicated a significant warship. Battle stations, Enright commanded quietly. Throughout the submarine, crew members moved to their designated positions with practiced efficiency. In the forward torpedo room, teams checked their weapons. In the control room, plotting teams prepared their charts and calculation boards. The hunt was underway. Enright faced an immediate challenge. The target was traveling at 20 knots, while Archerfish's maximum surface speed was 19 knots. Theoretically, the submarine could not catch her target. However, Enright was aware that Japanese ships frequently zigzag to evade submarines, and such course alterations would slow their progress. If he could predict the pattern and cut corners, he might be able to reduce the distance. For the next hour, Archerfish pursued at full speed, her 4 diesel engines straining. The submarine vibrated with the effort, her hull slicing through the swells, spray breaking over her bow. Below deck, engineers coaxed every possible revolution from the engines. The temperature in the engine room soared beyond 120 F. Crew members worked in shifts, rushing topside to gulp fresh air before returning to their posts. On Shinano's bridge, radar operators detected the American submarine almost immediately. Although the equipment might have been partially functional, it was sufficient to identify a surface contact at several miles. Captain Abe received the report with a sense of grim satisfaction. He had anticipated the presence of submarines. The waters surrounding Japan were teeming with them, yet he had devised plans to confront this menace. He commanded the signaling of the escorts. Enemy submarine located at bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters. Abe's tactical situation was intricate. His vessel, despite its considerable size, was susceptible. It lacked aircraft to detect submarines. Its sonar system was not yet operational. The ship relied entirely on its escorts for defense, and he was aware of their limited capabilities. The destroyer's sonar had sustained damage in prior engagements and had been repaired with substandard components. Their depth charge racks were only partially stocked. Resources were scarce across the board. Furthermore, Abe was confronted with a dilemma. If he instructed the destroyers to chase the submarine, they would have to abandon Shinano's side, potentially leaving her vulnerable to other submarines that might be lying in wait. American wolf packs frequently employed a strategy where one submarine would reveal itself to divert escorts while others moved in for the attack. However, if he kept the destroyers nearby, the pursuing submarine could follow them, transmitting their location to other vessels or aircraft. Abe opted for what appeared to be the most prudent course of action. He decided to maintain close proximity with his escorts and utilize speed and evasive maneuvers to evade pursuit. "Execute zigzag pattern number 7, he commanded. The helm adjusted, and Shinano's substantial form commenced a series of course alterations. 45 degrees to port, steady for 10 minutes, 60 degrees to starboard, steady for 8 minutes, back to the original course for 15 minutes, then repeat. The zigzag maneuver was a conventional anti-submarine tactic, yet it had its disadvantages. Each turn resulted in a loss of speed and distance. What should have been a 20-hour journey would now extend beyond that. Fuel consumption increased, and most critically, the pattern could be analyzed and anticipated by a seasoned submarine commander, which is precisely what Enright was doing. In the control room of Archerfish, the plotting team monitored each of Shinano's course adjustments. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobjinski, the executive officer, leaned over the chart table, calculating angles and times. "She is adhering to a standard pattern," he reported. "If we cut across her turns, we can gain distance." It evolved into a perilous game of geometry. Shinano would veer away, increasing the distance. Archerfish would take the corner, reducing it once more. The submarine could not match the carrier's straight-line speed, but by opting for shorter routes, she could maintain her pace. This demanded precise calculations and unwavering resolve. A single miscalculation could result in losing contact. A single detection by the destroyers would lead to a barrage of depth charges. As the pursuit extended into the night, Shinano's incomplete construction began to show its effects. At 11 p.m., a bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft started to overheat. The enormous shaft, rotating at high speed, generated friction that the bearing could not adequately dissipate. Temperature gauges soared into the red zone. The engineering officer faced a dire decision: to continue running and risk catastrophic failure, or to slow down and potentially fall victim to the submarine. He opted to reduce speed on that shaft. Shinano's speed decreased from 20 knots to 18. Although the reduction appeared minor, it was crucial. Now, Archerfish could not only keep pace but actually gain ground. On the submarine, the sonar operator noted the change in the target's engine sound. "She is slowing," he declared. Enright allowed himself a slight smile. The geometry of the hunt had shifted in his favor. However, Shinano's difficulties were just beginning. The rapid zigzagging, coupled with her incomplete construction, placed stress on systems throughout the ship. Electrical connections hastily installed began to fail. Lights flickered in certain compartments. Ventilation fans ceased operation. The temperature in the lower decks, already uncomfortable, became oppressive. Personnel working in the engine rooms had to be rotated every 20 minutes to avoid heat exhaustion. More seriously, the continuous alterations in course led the ship to roll and flex in ways that her incomplete structure was not equipped to handle. Seams that had been poorly welded began to open up. While this was not enough to cause immediate flooding, it was sufficient to permit seepage. Water started to gather in some of the lower compartments. Pumps were activated to manage the situation, but several of them malfunctioned. They had never undergone proper testing, and now, under actual operational conditions, their flaws became evident. On the bridge, Captain Abe received a series of reports detailing mechanical problems. Each issue was minor on its own, yet collectively they illustrated a vessel disintegrating under pressure. He was faced with a painful choice. He could reduce speed further, carefully bringing his ship to port, which would make her an easier target, or he could maintain speed and risk more severe failures. He opted for a compromise, decreasing speed to 16 knots and moderating the zigzag maneuver. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, this perilous maneuvering had persisted for over 5 hours. Archerfish had closed to within 7,000 yards of her target. Although still too distant for a torpedo strike, it was close enough to ensure solid contact. The crew of the submarine was fatigued, yet exhilarated. They could feel they were closing in on their quarry. Enright examined the tracking data with intense focus. Shinano's movement pattern was becoming evident. In spite of the zigzags, she consistently returned to a base course of 210 degrees southwest toward Kure. If he could position Archerfish ahead of that trajectory, and if he could anticipate when she would stabilize on that course, he would have his opportunity. "Take her down to radar depth," he commanded. The submarine descended beneath the surface, leaving only her radar antenna above the water. This action reduced her speed but made her significantly harder to detect. Now she was truly a predator in the darkness, unseen yet vigilant. On Shinano, the atmosphere was growing increasingly tense. The submarine had been shadowing them for hours. Why had it not launched an attack? Why had it not been repelled? Some officers speculated that it was summoning additional boats, suggesting they were being lured into a trap. Captain Abe dismissed such theories, yet privately he pondered. American submarine strategies had progressed throughout the conflict. They had become more assertive, more synchronized. At 2:56 a.m., fate took a turn. Isokaze, the leading destroyer, detected what her lookouts believed to be a periscope off the starboard side. Without waiting for commands, her captain accelerated and charged towards the contact. The destroyer's bow wave surged white in the darkness as she sped up to 35 knots. On Archerfish, the sonar operator's voice escalated in urgency. High-speed screws approaching. Destroyer bearing 340 closing rapidly. Enright had mere seconds to make a decision: crash dive and likely lose his target forever, or maintain his depth and risk being detected. He opted to dive, but only to 150 feet, shallow enough to resurface quickly. "Prepare for silent running," he commanded. "Prepare for depth charge." The destroyer passed directly overhead, her screws roaring through the water. Every crew member on Archerfish held their breath, anticipating the splash of depth charges, but none were released. Isokaze had lost contact and, more critically, had disobeyed Captain Abe's orders to keep formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge commanded her to return to position. The moment Isokaze veered away, Enright brought Archerfish back to periscope depth. Shinano remained in sight, still on course, now only 4,000 yards away. The opportunity he had awaited all night was finally at hand. At 3:15 a.m., everything fell into place. Shinano steadied on her base course of 210 degrees. She was broadside to Archerfish. Range 1,400 yards, speed 16 knots. In submarine warfare, it was the ideal scenario: close enough for precision, angled for maximum target area, slow enough for an accurate solution. Enright made his final observations through the periscope. The carrier dominated his view, immense beyond anything he had ever encountered. Her flight deck extended like a sheer cliff face. Her island structure ascended like a building. He observed lights in several of her portholes, the silhouettes of her escorts and the white water at her bow. He quickly sketched, capturing her unusual rounded bow, which was unlike any carrier depicted in the recognition manuals. "Final bearing and shoot," he commanded. "Prepare all tubes." In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes stood ready. These weapons had posed challenges earlier in the war due to faulty detonators and running depths, but those issues had been resolved. Now they were dependable ship destroyers, each equipped with 600 OLB of Torpex explosive. "Set depth to 10 FT, Enright instructed. It was unusually shallow, but he recalled advice from a senior officer regarding carriers struck high on the hull, where the damage would compromise stability rather than merely cause flooding. The fire control team completed their final calculations. Target speed, angle, distance, all were input into the torpedo data computer, an analog device that determined the appropriate firing angle. The solution was verified and re-verified. There would be no second opportunity. Fire 1. The submarine trembled as the first torpedo exited its tube. A surge of compressed air propelled the weapon, which instantly activated, its propellers whirling, driving it toward the target at 46 knots. Fire 2. 8 seconds elapsed between shots, allowing each torpedo sufficient time to clear before the next was launched. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 6. In under a minute, 6 death sentences sped through the water towards Shinano. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and true, precisely as intended. Their wakes, barely discernible in the darkness, traced straight lines toward the carrier's hull. On Shinano's bridge, lookouts detected the wakes. Too late. "Torpedo starboard!" I echoed the alarm. Captain Abe commanded full rudder, but the carrier's immense mass reacted sluggishly. She had scarcely begun her turn when the first torpedo impacted. The explosion was colossal. A plume of water surged up alongside the hull, higher than the flight deck. The ship lurched to port from the force of the impact. Before the crew had the opportunity to respond, the second torpedo struck, followed by the third and then the fourth. 4 impacts occurred in under 30 seconds, all targeting the starboard side, specifically between the bow and the island structure. The initial torpedo hit at frame 104 near an aviation fuel tank that, fortunately, was empty. The explosion created a 20 FT wide breach in the hull, instantly flooding adjacent compartments. The second torpedo impacted frame 142, obliterating the starboard outboard engine room. The personnel on duty there were killed immediately as water and superheated steam filled the area. The third torpedo hit frame 166, exposing the number 3 fire room to the ocean. The fourth torpedo struck frame 190, rupturing another fuel tank and causing oil to surge through the passages. For a brief moment, those on Shinano's bridge struggled to grasp the magnitude of the situation. The ship trembled with each strike, yet her massive size made the torpedoes appear almost trivial. Captain Abe's initial thought was that she could withstand this level of damage. After all, she had been constructed with battleship-grade armor intended to endure multiple torpedo strikes. However, below decks, disaster was unfolding. The incomplete construction that had long plagued Shinano now proved to be fatal. Watertight doors that had never undergone testing failed immediately. Some became jammed, trapping personnel in flooding compartments, while others would not close at all. Seams that had been hastily welded began to split under pressure. Electrical panels drenched with water short-circuited, resulting in showers of sparks. The damage control teams responded to the crisis as best as they could, but they were engaged in a losing struggle. The men had never practiced as a cohesive unit. Orders were muddled and contradictory. Some teams hurried to flood counteracting compartments on the port side to address the list, while others attempted to pump out the flooded areas. These two efforts counteracted one another. In the engine rooms, the situation was dire. The starboard engine rooms were rapidly filling with water. Engineers labored in the rising water, striving to maintain power to the pumps. As water reached the electrical panels, a series of explosive sparks compelled the crew to withdraw. One after another, the starboard engines ceased operation. The list of the ship increased gradually, first to 5 degrees and then to 10 degree and finally to 13 degree. On the flight deck, aircraft and equipment began to slide uncontrollably. Sailors formed human chains in an attempt to secure loose items, but their efforts proved futile. A fuel truck broke loose and collided with the island structure. Boxes of ammunition fell into the sea. Captain Abe maintained a stoic demeanor, on the bridge. He ordered counter-flooding to rectify the list. He charted a course for the nearest land, hoping to run the ship aground. He sent messages to naval headquarters. Shinano was torpedoed at position 30° 0 north, 137° 0 east, in an effort to reach the shore. However, even as he issued these commands, he must have been aware of the grim reality. The reports from below decks were consistently bleak. Flooding was spiraling out of control. The pumps were unable to keep up. Half of the crew were unfamiliar with their damage control stations. The ship was succumbing. Meanwhile, aboard Archerfish, Enright had taken the submarine deep immediately after firing. Now came the most perilous moment for any submarine: the counterattack. Above them, Japanese destroyers were darting back and forth, their sonar pinging, and their crews preparing depth charges. 400 F'd, Enright commanded. Rig for silent running. The submarine descended into the darker depths. Every man on board remained silent, breathing shallowly. They could hear the destroyers above, the high-speed whine of screws, the ping of active sonar, and the splash of depth charges entering the water. The first pattern detonated. 5 charges exploded in sequence. The submarine trembled. Light bulbs burst. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. Yet the explosions were distant, at least 500 yards away. The Japanese sonar, damaged and poorly maintained, was unable to obtain an accurate fix on the submarine. More charges followed, totaling 14. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the water, shaking the submarine, but none were close enough to inflict serious damage. After an hour, the sounds above began to fade. The destroyers had ceased their pursuit and returned to their stricken vessel. When Enright finally brought Archerfish back to periscope depth at dawn, the horizon was devoid of any sight. Whatever fate had befallen the massive carrier, she was no longer present. As dawn emerged on November 29th, Shinano was in her final moments. The list had escalated to 20 degrees. Navigating the tilted decks was becoming increasingly difficult. Crew members utilized ropes to assist themselves up the inclined surfaces. In the hangar deck, the Oka suicide planes had become dislodged, colliding with one another, their volatile rocket fuel posing a significant fire risk. The flooding had extended well beyond the initial torpedo damage. This was the occurrence that naval architects referred to as progressive flooding. Water was finding its way through doors, vents, cable runs, and any openings, spreading like a malignant growth throughout the ship. Compartments that were expected to remain secure were filling with water. The immense weight of thousands of tons of water was pulling Shinano deeper into the sea. Captain Abe made a final effort to salvage his ship. He commanded all engines to go full ahead, attempting to steer Shinano towards the shore. However, with only the port engines operational, the vessel could barely reach 10 knots. She was moving in circles, her rudder unable to adjust for the uneven thrust. At Aero 830, Abe authorized the emergency signal: "Prepare to abandon ship." This was not yet a command to evacuate, but rather a caution to be prepared. Sailors began to assemble on the flight deck, assisting injured comrades from below. Life jackets were handed out. The destroyers approached closer, readying themselves to rescue survivors. Below decks, acts of bravery and sorrow unfolded. Engineers remained at their stations, ensuring the lights stayed on, and the pumps continued to operate until the water forced them out. Medical officers labored in tilting sick bays, striving to evacuate patients. In one inundated compartment, 30 men found themselves trapped behind a jammed hatch. Their desperate hammering could be heard for an hour before it ceased. The conclusion arrived swiftly. At 10:18, the list abruptly surged to 35 degrees. Equipment, Aircraft and personnel began to slide uncontrollably off the flight deck and into the sea. The command was given. All hands were ordered to abandon ship. However, for many it was already too late. The list increased so swiftly that hundreds found themselves trapped inside. Others, attempting to ascend the tilted deck, lost their grip and fell. Some leaped from the flight deck, a drop of 60 feet that resulted in fatalities upon impact. Captain Abe stayed on the bridge. As per tradition, he intended to go down with his ship. He secured himself to the helm, resolved to uphold dignity until the very end. Surrounding him, his senior officers made the same decision. They sang the national anthem as the water rose around them. At 10:55, Shinano capsized. Her flight deck tilted beyond vertical, then she completely rolled over. For a brief moment, her enormous hull was visible, barnacles and red anti-fouling paint shining in the morning sun. Then, with a deafening roar of escaping air, she sank beneath the surface. The largest warship in the world had endured merely 17 hours at sea. The waters where Shinano sank were strewn with debris and desperate men. Over 2,000 had been on board. Now hundreds struggled in the oil-slicked water. The three destroyers navigated among them, rescuing survivors. However, the rescue was selective. Naval tradition dictated that officers should be prioritized for rescue. Some destroyer captains, battle-hardened, refused to rescue men who exhibited panic. Only the brave were to be saved. One captain instructed his crew the outcome was tragedy upon tragedy. Men who had survived the sinking drowned within sight of rescue ships. Others, coated in oil, were too slippery to grasp and slipped beneath the waves. The winter sea was frigid. Hypothermia claimed those who were not quickly rescued. When the rescue concluded, 1,080 men had been saved. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and most of his senior officers, were deceased. This incident marked one of the largest losses of life in a single ship sinking during the Pacific War. For Japan, the loss was devastating, yet it had to be concealed. Shinano had been a state secret. Her loss would remain one. Survivors were bound to confidentiality. The families of the deceased were informed solely that their loved ones had perished in combat, without details regarding the circumstances or location. The official documentation was classified. To the Japanese populace, Shinano had never been acknowledged. However, secrets are challenging to maintain during wartime. American codebreakers analyzing intercepted communications discovered the sinking within a matter of days. The name Shinano surfaced in decrypted messages alongside her coordinates at the time of the torpedo strike. Intelligence officials were baffled. They had no record of a vessel by that designation. What had the Archerfish actually sunk when Enright submitted his patrol report in December, asserting that he had sunk a carrier of unprecedented dimensions? He faced doubt. Navy intelligence maintained that no such carrier was in existence. The maximum they would attribute to him was a 28,000-ton carrier, which, while considerable, fell significantly short of the truth. It was only after the war, when American investigators accessed Japanese documentation, that the reality was uncovered. Shinano had a full load displacement of 71,890 tons. She was indeed the largest carrier ever constructed at that time and remains the largest warship ever lost to a submarine attack. Enright's instincts had proven accurate, and his redemption was fulfilled. The narrative of Shinano's solitary voyage imparts lessons that extend beyond the specific occurrences of November 1944. It is a story of arrogance and modesty, of grand aspirations thwarted by fundamental shortcomings, illustrating how the smallest predator can bring down the mightiest prey when circumstances are favorable. For Japan, Shinano symbolized the failure of the decisive weapon doctrine. Throughout the conflict, Japanese strategists pursued singular war machines, super battleships, divine wind assaults, and miraculous carriers. However, wars are won through systems, not mere symbols. While Japan constructed one enormous carrier, America produced numerous smaller ones. While Japan hastily deployed incomplete vessels, America invested time in adequately training crews. The outcome was unavoidable. The technical insights were equally as evident. Size without dependability equates to vulnerability. Armor without effective damage control offers a false sense of security. A ship's strength is derived not solely from its steel, but also from the training of its crew, the quality of its construction, and the integrity of every weld and seal. Shinano did not fail due to a flawed design, but rather because her execution was incomplete. For the submarine force, the sinking of Shinano validated their strategy of attrition. Submarines, which are relatively inexpensive and manned by fewer than 100 personnel, have the capability to destroy capital ships valued at thousands of times their cost. The silent service demonstrated its ability to strike anywhere at any time against any target. The era of the submarine as a strategic weapon had indeed arrived. Commander Enright's personal journey from failure to redemption resonated throughout the Navy. His narrative illustrated that a single failure does not have to define a career, and that persistence and courage can surmount past errors. He confronted his demons and emerged triumphant. The Navy Cross he was awarded was not solely for the sinking of Shinano, but also for his determination to continue fighting after previous defeats. The human cost of this story is haunting. Over 1,400 Japanese sailors perished, many of whom were conscripts who had never wished to engage in warfare. They died trapped in flooding compartments, thrown from tilting decks, or abandoned in frigid waters. Their sacrifice yielded nothing. Shinano never launched an aircraft in anger, never defended her homeland, and never justified the resources expended on her construction. Presently, Shinano rests at a depth of 4,000 meters off Cape Omazaki. She lies inverted, her flight deck buried in sediment, and her hull gradually collapsing under the immense pressure of depth and time. She serves as a tomb for the men who perished with her and as a monument to the era when nations believed that larger meant better and that a single perfect weapon could alter everything. Contemporary naval strategists examine Shinano as a cautionary tale. In an age dominated by nuclear carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the lessons remain pertinent. Complexity necessitates competence. Size demands support. No vessel, regardless of its power, is stronger than the system that constructs, maintains, and operates it. The sinking also illustrates the influence of chance in warfare. If Shinano had departed a day earlier or later, if Archerfish had been assigned to a different mission, or if the torpedoes had run deep rather than shallow, the course of history would have changed. Warfare encompasses not only strategy and technology, but also elements of luck and timing. On that fateful November night in 1944, all factors converge perfectly for Archerfish and disastrously for Shinano. In the years following the conflict, the tale of Shinano and Archerfish became legendary within naval communities. Authors penned books, and historians scrutinized the engagement. Veterans recounted their experiences. Each retelling enriched the narrative, rectified inaccuracies, and shaped the story we recognize today. Commander Enright advanced to a distinguished naval career, retiring as a rear admiral. He seldom spoke publicly about the sinking, embodying the quiet professionalism characteristic of the submarine service. When questioned about that night, he would simply state, "We did our duty. The torpedoes functioned. We were fortunate." However, those familiar with him understood that this statement encompassed much more. It represented the validation of his bravery, the affirmation of his rightful place in command, and the second chance he had grasped. The crew of Archerfish held reunions for many years. They would convene these aging men, once youthful sailors, to reminisce about their moment of triumph. They recounted tales of the prolonged pursuit, the anxiety of the approach, and the thunderous impact of the torpedoes striking home. Yet they also honored the crew of Shinano, fellow sailors who had perished while fulfilling their duty. War had rendered them adversaries, but time transformed them into mere men who had served at sea. Some survivors of Shinano eventually shared their accounts after the shroud of secrecy was finally lifted. They described the pandemonium, the terror, and the sight of their formidable vessel capsizing and sinking. They recalled Captain AB's last moments, standing resolutely as the water surged. They remembered comrades who assisted them in escaping inundated compartments, who relinquished life jackets, and who propelled others to safety before being dragged under themselves. In Japan, Shinano emerged as a symbol of the final phase of the war. Grand gestures that yielded no results, magnificent failures that only exacerbated the suffering. She epitomized the peril of believing in one's own propaganda, of mistaking appearance for reality, of hastening toward disaster instead of accepting defeat. For America, the sinking underscored the democratic essence of naval warfare, illustrating that 80 men in a submarine could triumph over thousands in a carrier, that patience and skill could prevail over size and armor. It was a modern-day David and Goliath, manifested in steel and torpedoes, demonstrating that in warfare, even the smallest unit could secure a strategic victory. The wreck of Shinano was located in 2019 by deep-sea explorers. The images they retrieved revealed a ship astonishingly intact despite decades submerged. Her hull, constructed to battleship standards, had withstood the pressure that would have crushed lesser vessels, yet she lies overturned, her intended glory eternally entombed in the seafloor, a testament to ambition that surpassed capability. Today, as nations once more vie to construct the largest, most formidable warships, the narrative of Shinano remains pertinent. Technology progresses, but the human elements that led to her downfall endure. Ships continue to be built in haste. Crews still embark with inadequate training. Leaders persist in the belief that a singular supreme weapon can alter everything. The specter of Shinano cautions against such arrogance. The ultimate lesson may be the most universal. In war, as in life, the race does not invariably go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. At times, patience triumphs over power. Occasionally, the hunter becomes the hunted. A single knight's actions can resonate through history, imparting lessons to generations yet unborn about courage, folly, and the fragile line between victory and disaster. On that November night in 1944, two ships encountered each other in the obscurity of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever constructed, while the other was a standard submarine of no particular distinction. When dawn broke, only one remained. Such is the essence of naval warfare, abrupt, conclusive, and irrevocable. The sea exhibits no bias towards magnitude or power. It consumes all impartially, concealing its mysteries in the shadowy abyss where Shinano lies undisturbed. The most colossal warship ever brought down by a submarine, a behemoth Defeated by a hunter it never fully perceived,